When I woke up from a coma with no memory of my past, I couldn't remember names, faces, or events, but my body remembered fear. And that instinctive terror of the people claiming to be my family would lead me to discover the most shocking truth of my life. My name is Sophia. I'm 26 years old, and 3 months ago I woke up in Denver General Hospital with complete retrograde amnesia after a severe car accident. The doctors told me I'd been unconscious for 6 weeks, and that I was lucky to be alive. What they didn't tell me was that sometimes losing your memory is the only way to see the truth about your life. If you're watching this from Denver or anywhere else in the world, please leave a comment below telling me what city you're from. Because what I'm about to share will make you question everything you think you know about family bonds and the lies people tell to protect their secrets. And please hit that subscribe button, because this story will show you how sometimes our instincts know things our minds have forgotten. When I first opened my eyes in that hospital room, I saw 3 people standing around my bed. A middle-aged man with graying hair, a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, and a younger man who looked to be in his early 30s. They were all smiling, but something about their smiles made my stomach clench with anxiety. "Sophia," the woman said, rushing to my bedside. "Oh, honey, we were so worried. Do you remember us?" I looked at their faces, searching for any spark of recognition, any warm feeling of familiarity. Nothing. But worse than the emptiness was the cold dread that spread through my chest when she touched my hand. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice hoarse from weeks of not speaking. "I don't remember anything." The man stepped forward. "I'm your father, David. This is your mother, Patricia, and your brother, James. You're our daughter, and you're safe now." The doctor, a kind woman named Dr. Martinez, explained my condition to all of us. Retrograde amnesia after severe head trauma. Sophia may never recover her memories from before the accident. The important thing is that she's alive, and her cognitive functions are intact. Over the next few days, as I remained in the hospital for observation, David, Patricia, and James took turns visiting me. They brought photo albums, told me stories about my childhood, and tried to help me piece together my life. But with every story they told, that feeling of unease grew stronger. "Remember when you were 8 and you fell off your bike?" Patricia would say, showing me a photo of a little girl with a bandaged knee. "You cried for hours until I made you your favorite cookies." I studied the photo. The little girl looked like me, but something felt wrong. "What kind of cookies were my favorite?" Patricia paused for just a moment too long. "Chocolate chip, of course." But when I tasted chocolate chip cookies later, they made me feel nauseous. It was peanut butter cookies that made my mouth water, though I couldn't explain why. "Tell me about my room," I asked James during one of his visits. "What did it look like?" "Oh, you had a pink room with a canopy bed. You loved princess stuff when you were little." But when I tried to imagine a pink room, I felt suffocated. It was the thought of blue walls and astronomy posters that made me feel calm, though I had no idea why. The worst part was how they acted around me. Patricia would flinch slightly whenever I moved too quickly. David would watch me with this calculating expression when he thought I wasn't looking. And James barely made eye contact with me at all. When I was finally discharged from the hospital, they took me to what they said was my family home in the affluent Highlands neighborhood of Denver. It was a beautiful 2-story house with a perfectly manicured lawn, but as we pulled into the driveway, every muscle in my body tensed. "Welcome home, sweetheart," Patricia said, but her voice sounded forced. I walked through that house like I was touring a museum. Nothing felt familiar, nothing felt like home. But worse than the lack of recognition was the active discomfort I felt in every room. They showed me to my bedroom, a pink room with a canopy bed, just like James had described. But standing in that doorway, I felt like I couldn't breathe. "Actually," I said, surprising myself, "could I sleep in a different room tonight? This one feels too overwhelming right now." Patricia and David exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. "Of course, honey," David said. "You can use the guest room until you feel more comfortable." The guest room was smaller, with blue walls and a simple bed. The moment I walked in, my shoulders relaxed for the first time since leaving the hospital. That night, as I lay in the guest bed staring at the ceiling, I tried to understand what was happening to me. The doctors had said that sometimes emotional memories could persist, even when factual memories were lost. But why would I have negative emotional associations with people who were supposed to be my family? I started paying closer attention to the little things. The way Patricia would tense up when I entered a room. The way David's jaw would clench when I asked certain questions. The way James seemed relieved when I said I didn't remember our childhood together. 3 weeks into my stay at their house, I was looking through one of the photo albums they'd given me when I noticed something strange. In all the childhood photos, the little girl they claimed was me looked happy enough, but she was always slightly separated from the rest of the family. While David, Patricia, and James were close together and touching in photos, the little girl stood a few inches away or was positioned at the edge of the group. Why do I look so separate in these family photos? I asked Patricia one morning over breakfast. She didn't look up from her coffee. What do you mean? In all these pictures, I'm never really part of the group. I'm always on the outside. You were just shy, she said quickly. You never liked being the center of attention, but that didn't feel right either. When I imagined being in front of cameras or groups of people now, I didn't feel shy. I felt wary, like I'd learned to be invisible for my own protection. That afternoon, I decided to explore the house more thoroughly. I wanted to find something, anything, that would trigger a real memory, or at least feel genuinely familiar. I was searching through a closet in the hallway when I found a box pushed way back in the corner, covered with dust. Inside were more photos, but these were different. These photos showed David, Patricia, and James at various events and holidays, but I wasn't in any of them. The timestamps on the photos showed they were taken throughout my supposed childhood and teenage years. My hands were shaking as I looked through them. Christmas mornings with just the three of them. Birthday parties where I was nowhere to be seen. Family vacations to places I'd never been. What are you doing? I spun around to find James standing in the hallway, his face pale. I found these photos, I said, holding up the box. Why aren't I in any of them? James looked panicked. Those are old photos. From before. Look, Sophia, you shouldn't be going through old stuff. It might confuse you more. Confuse me more? I stood up, still holding the photos. James, I'm not in these photos. These are family photos from when I was supposedly living here, and I'm not in a single one. You were probably taking the pictures, he said weakly. All of them? For years? I felt that familiar dread rising in my chest, but this time it was mixed with something else. Anger. Who am I, James? Because I'm starting to think I'm not who you all say I am. James ran his hand through his hair, looking around nervously. Look, this is complicated. You should talk to Mom and Dad. I'm talking to you. Right now. Tell me the truth. That's when I saw it in his eyes. Guilt, fear, and something that looked almost like relief. I can't, he whispered. I'm sorry, Sophia. I can't. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing in that hallway holding a box of photos that proved my entire existence in this family was a lie. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the photos, about the way my body reacted to these people, about the inconsistencies in their stories. When morning came, I had made a decision. I was going to find out who I really was, with or without their help. I started by going to the Denver Public Library and using their computers to search for any records of myself. What I found, or rather, what I didn't find, changed everything. According to public records, Sophia Martinez had been born 26 years ago, but there was almost no trace of her existence before 5 years ago. No school records, no medical records, no employment history. It was like Sophia Martinez had appeared out of nowhere when she was 21 years old. But there was something else. A missing person report filed 21 years ago for a 5-year-old girl named Sophia Chen. The report had been filed by an elderly woman named Margaret Chen, who was listed as the child's guardian. The photo attached to the missing person report made my blood run cold. It was definitely me as a child, but I was wearing the kind of simple clothes you'd find at a thrift store, not the expensive outfits the little girl in Patricia and David's photos was wearing. Margaret Chen had reported that her granddaughter had disappeared from a park in downtown Denver. The case had gone cold after 6 months. I sat in that library for 3 hours, staring at that missing person report and trying to process what it meant. Had I been kidnapped as a child? Had David and Patricia taken me from my real family? And if so, why? I printed out copies of everything I'd found and drove back to the house in Highlands. When I walked through the front door, David, Patricia, and James were all sitting in the living room like they'd been waiting for me. "We need to talk," Patricia said, her voice cold and controlled. I held up the papers I'd printed. "Yes, we do. Starting with why there's a missing person report for a child named Sophia Chen who looks exactly like me." The silence in that room was deafening. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then David slowly stood up. How much do you remember? He asked quietly. I remember enough, I lied, hoping my instincts would guide me through whatever was about to happen. What came next would reveal a truth so shocking that I would understand why my body had been trying to protect me with fear from the moment I woke up in that hospital room. What David told me next would explain everything. Why I felt like a stranger in my own supposed family, why my body remembered fear even when my mind was blank, and why 3 people had spent 5 years lying to me about who I really was. David walked to the window and stood with his back to me for a long moment. When he finally turned around, his face looked 10 years older. Your real name is Sophia Chen, he said quietly. And we did take you from your grandmother when you were 5 years old. The words hit me like a physical blow, but underneath the shock was something unexpected. Relief. My instincts had been right all along. We didn't kidnap you, Patricia said quickly, her voice defensive. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. James finally looked at me directly. Your grandmother was old and sick. She couldn't take care of you properly. We were trying to help. By stealing a child and filing a false missing person report to cover your tracks? She didn't file that report, David said. We did. I stared at him in confusion. What? We took you from the park that day because we'd been watching your situation for weeks. Your grandmother could barely take care of herself, let alone a 5-year-old. You were dirty, underfed, and clearly neglected. We called social services multiple times, but they were overwhelmed and understaffed. Patricia continued the story. We had been trying to have another child for years after James was born, but I kept miscarrying. When we saw you in that park, alone and scared while your grandmother had fallen asleep on a bench, we made a split-second decision. You kidnapped me. We saved you, David said firmly. And we filed the missing person report ourselves to make it look like Margaret had reported you missing. We thought if anyone investigated, they'd assume she was just a grieving grandmother whose story didn't add up because of her dementia. I felt sick. So you let an old woman spend the rest of her life thinking her granddaughter was dead or worse. Margaret Chen died 6 months after we took you, Patricia said softly. She never knew what happened to you, but she also never had to see you suffer anymore. The room was spinning. I gripped the arm of the chair I was sitting in, trying to process what they were telling me. Why are you telling me this now? Why not just keep lying? James answered. Because your accident changed things. When you were in the coma, the hospital needed medical history, and we had to tell them the truth about your background. They have records now. If you ever try to get your full medical file, you'll see that you're not genetically related to any of us. And, David added, because we're tired of lying. I looked at these 3 people who had built their family on a foundation of theft and deception, and I tried to understand how they could think what they'd done was justified. What was my life like here? Really? Patricia and David exchanged another look. You were difficult to integrate, Patricia admitted. You cried for your grandmother constantly for the first year. You kept trying to run away. You wouldn't call us mom and dad. We had to homeschool you because you kept telling people at school that we weren't your real family. So you isolated me. We protected you, David corrected. And eventually, you settled in. By the time you were a teenager, you seemed to accept that this was your family. But even as he said it, I could see in his eyes that it wasn't true. I never accepted it, did I? I just learned to survive. James spoke up then, his voice barely above a whisper. You were always planning to leave. As soon as you turned 18, you started asking questions about getting your birth certificate and ID. You wanted to go to college, but you also wanted to find out about your past. What happened when I turned 18? We told you the truth about your background, Patricia said. Some of it, anyway. We said we'd adopted you from foster care when you were 5, and that your birth parents were dead, and your grandmother couldn't care for you. But I didn't believe you. No, David said sadly. You didn't. You started researching, trying to find records. That's when you found Margaret Chen's obituary and realized the timeline didn't match what we'd told you. I was starting to understand. So what did you do? The silence stretched on for so long, I thought they wouldn't answer. Finally, Patricia spoke. We made sure you had an accident. The words hung in the air like poison. I felt like I couldn't breathe. You what? Not the car accident, James said quickly. That was real. But before that, when you were 21 and getting too close to the truth, we had you committed to a psychiatric facility. My whole body went cold. You had me committed? You were having what looked like a mental breakdown, David said defensively. You were paranoid, claiming we'd kidnapped you, saying you had memories of another life. The doctors diagnosed you with dissociative identity disorder and severe anxiety. Because you gaslit me into thinking I was crazy. Because you were acting crazy, Patricia snapped, then immediately looked like she regretted it. We thought if you got professional help, you'd be able to accept your life here and move forward. How long was I there? 6 months, James said quietly. When you came out, you were different. Quieter. You stopped asking questions about your past. You got a job, moved into a small apartment across town, and we thought everything was settled. I was beginning to understand why my body had such negative reactions to these people. Even without conscious memories, some part of me remembered being betrayed, manipulated, and gaslit by them. The car accident, I said. How did it happen? Another long silence. You had started remembering things again, David finally said. Little pieces. You came to the house 3 months ago and confronted us. You said you'd hired a private investigator and you were going to expose us. So you tried to kill me? No, Patricia said, tears streaming down her face. We would never hurt you physically. The accident was real. You were driving away from here after our confrontation, and it was raining, and you hit a patch of black ice on I-25. But we didn't call the ambulance right away, James added, looking ashamed. We thought if you died in the accident, all our problems would be solved. We waited 20 minutes before calling 911. I stared at them in horror. You let me lie there dying for 20 minutes while you decided whether to save my life? We're sorry, Patricia whispered. We panicked. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking. You kidnapped me, isolated me from anyone who might help me remember my real family, gaslit me into thinking I was mentally ill when I started remembering the truth, and then you let me almost die while you debated whether saving me was worth the inconvenience. Sophia, please, David started. My name isn't Sophia Martinez, I said firmly. It's Sophia Chen, and I want to know everything about my real family. What they told me next broke my heart. My grandmother Margaret had been a retired nurse who took me in when my parents died in a house fire when I was 3. She had limited income, but unlimited love, and she had been teaching me Mandarin and telling me stories about my parents and our family history. She had photo albums, Patricia admitted, full of pictures of you with your parents, and of her teaching you to cook Chinese food and practice calligraphy. We destroyed them all when we took you. She had also started a college fund for you, David added. $3,000 she'd saved from her Social Security checks. We used it to buy you clothes and toys, thinking it would help you adjust. I felt like screaming, but instead I asked, is there anything left? Any trace of my real life? James disappeared upstairs and came back with a small wooden box. We kept these, he said, handing it to me. We told ourselves it was in case you ever asked questions, but really, I think we kept them because we felt guilty. Inside the box were treasures that made my heart ache. A jade bracelet that had belonged to my mother, a photo of my parents on their wedding day, a letter my grandmother had written to me for my 18th birthday that I'd never received, and a small notebook filled with Chinese characters in my grandmother's handwriting. She was teaching you to write your name in Chinese, Patricia said softly. You were so proud when you learned it. As I held these pieces of my stolen life, I felt something I hadn't experienced since waking up in the hospital. Genuine emotion connected to actual memories. Not the artificial warmth they'd tried to create with fake photo albums and false stories, but real love from people who had truly cared about me. I'm leaving, I said, closing the box carefully, and I'm never coming back. Where will you go? David asked. You don't have anyone else. I'll find my people, I said. My real community, the family that Margaret would have wanted me to have. As I walked out of that house for the last time, carrying the small wooden box of my true heritage, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Over the next weeks, I used the few clues I had to research my parents' and grandmother's life. I found relatives I'd never known existed, cousins and family friends who remembered me as a little girl, and had wondered for 21 years what had happened to Margaret's granddaughter. I also found Margaret's house, which had been sold after her death, but where the new owners had found more photo albums and keepsakes in the attic. They had been waiting years for someone from the family to claim them. Today, I live in my grandmother's old neighborhood, surrounded by people who knew and loved her. I'm learning to cook the Chinese dishes she had started teaching me, and I'm studying Mandarin to reconnect with the language she wanted me to know. David, Patricia, and James were arrested and charged with kidnapping, child endangerment, and fraud. They're awaiting trial, and I'll be testifying against them. If you're watching this, and something about your family has never felt right, trust your instincts. Sometimes our bodies remember what our minds try to forget, and sometimes the people who claim to love us are really just protecting themselves. Please subscribe to this channel and comment below telling me what city you're watching from. Share this story with anyone who might need to hear that it's never too late to reclaim your true identity. I'm Sophia Chen, I'm 26 years old, and I learned that losing your memory can sometimes be the greatest gift because it forces you to discover who you really are underneath all the lies other people have built around you. Sometimes the family that takes you in isn't the family that loves you, and sometimes finding yourself means having the courage to walk away from the only life you've ever known, even when you can't remember why it never felt like home.